Thank you, and good morning. Welcome to, I was going to say a chat, but we only have 10 minutes, so I'll call it a chatlet, with Douglas Becker, who is the founder, chairman, and CEO of Laureate, the world's leading network of higher education institutions. Just a full disclosure, I've actually known Doug for close to 25 years. We're fellow Baltimoreans, and I've watched Doug as a really important and key civic leader in Baltimore. I've watched you lead important nonprofit institutions as board chair of International Youth Foundation, and I've watched you lead Laureate as a good citizen in Baltimore through the Sylvan Laureate Foundation. But it's interesting, in 2015, Laureate and its network institutions became certified B Corps and became the largest certified B Corp in the world, as well as the first multinational corporation to have all subsidiaries certified. In addition, Laureate is also the first higher ed company to be certified. And this year, Laureate became the first PBC, public benefit corporation, to be publicly traded on any stock exchange in the world. That was a lot, but given that we don't just want this to be a convening, we want it to be a learning opportunity. Doug, I want to ask you first, what was your rationale for making those truly historic changes and taking these steps?
Well, thanks very much, and thanks for doing this today, Cheryl. I so admire what you do, and really it's appropriate because in the work that you do in seeking out people who are trying to accomplish things and have a social mission, in many ways, we see that the nonprofit world tends to accumulate a lot of the talent that's focused on social impact. And the business world tends to simplify and focus, we heard earlier, sort of the idea of CSR as table stakes. And in some cases for business, it's a very short path towards trying to look good. And then that, unfortunately, I think has added to some of the cynicism around whether business really is good for society. And so in our case, we were really forced to wrestle with this because we're in the business of education, and there are a lot of people who really doubt whether industry belongs in education. And while we've tried to prove through our own actions that we can contribute to society and that we can actually be thought leaders and innovators and make an impact as educators, I use the expression, a company of educators, because people don't think of business that can be engaged in education. In fact, for many years, they didn't think of it at all. And then in recent years, they've thought of it as a bad thing and read about abuses and questions that become raised about the proper role of business in a social field like education or healthcare or many other cases. So we've been forced to wrestle with this issue for a long time. At the same time, we see society changing and demanding much more out of everyone. We all see it in the news today. People are demanding more out of people's behavior. People are demanding more in inclusion, and customers are demanding more. We heard about this in the panel before, and that is a great way to be led to doing good things, is when you're led by your customers or led by inspiring young people working in your organization. So these are the things that brought us to a point. After a while, we realized that the way we had survived was to act in a way that took into consideration in all of our big decisions the impact that we had on lots of constituents. And we were fortunate that we had shareholders who accepted that that was necessary for us to survive and prosper. I don't think every company would find that to be the case. What I didn't realize is that there was a framework being developed that would allow a company like ours to essentially communicate what it intended within a framework that was broad and universal, and that was the B Corp framework, which is essentially a certification framework that allows you to be assessed by an independent external organization who measures your ability to take these constituents' needs into account in your decision making and how you impact your workforce and the environment and the communities that you serve and your customers. And that's something that we had done, but with our own internal metrics, without realizing that we could have a universal set of metrics that we could measure ourselves against. So that was the B Corp idea. And we worked very closely with the group, and I know that Jay from B Lab will be, I think, maybe one of our next speakers, and will explain not only the assessment framework, but also the movement They really have a vision of being proponents for the idea that business can be a force for good. And I think that that is so important with the cynicism that I mentioned before. How can you have business and let's say the commercial capital system is one of the most powerful levers that we have at our disposal. We can't write it off. And in education, when I've had to defend the role of a company playing a role in education, I often have to remind people that almost all of the graduates of the university system end up working for business. So it is something that has to be taken very seriously into account. And then the second framework that we discovered was a legal framework, which is called the Public Benefit Corporation, which is actually something that B-Lab has also been the main mover behind. And that essentially creates a governance framework in which a board of directors is obligated to show that they consider the needs of multiple constituents and not just shareholders in their key decision. And so we also became a public benefit corporation.
Fantastic. And again, we're very short on time, and I want to make sure, since the audience does not have time to ask Doug any questions, I want to make sure you leave a few takeaways. And I love that you use the language of movements. I mean, Echoing Green has been around for 30 years, really at the intersection of social innovation and social justice. So that movement framework makes a lot of sense to me. And there are now about 5,000 PBCs in this country, about 2,200 certified B Corps around the world. But at the same time, I'm sure many of you read the David Gellis story in the New York Times about inside the Etsy revolution as they became public in 2015, but are in the process of decertifying through B Corps. Tell us some lessons learned or some takeaways that you want all of us to consider trying to make business as a force for good. But it is complicated, right, Doug?
It is complicated, and I think it's something that we have to give a try. I think if any time that there are obstacles or hurdles, if you let it deter you, you're not going to accomplish anything. And the things, as we all know, that are most worth doing tend to be really hard. Right. So creating a model for a more scalable, accountable higher education system, which is what we've been doing, really hard to do. And the fact that actually people actively work to impede our progress or or have an ideology that makes them want to impede our progress, it would be easy to just throw in the towel. And I think the same on this point here, and I've followed the Etsy situation very carefully. And we haven't yet been tested. We're a public company, and our shareholders, I think they see that what we do requires a level of public trust and requires a level of government support and trust to believe that what we do is worthwhile. So for us, I'd say some of our lessons have to do with scale. We have 1 million students. We have over 70,000 employees around the world. There hadn't been an organization of this size going through a certification process like this, and I think it really tested us and B-Lab in the process because it was initially a movement of small companies. Right. And yet I think the whole idea should be better applied to public companies where there's actually, I'd say, a more corrosive influence of short-term thinking, quarterly earnings. These are things that force companies to think in the short term. And that is, and I think if there's anything that we can do to try to encourage people to think a little bit longer term, and I'd say most CEOs either try to do this or at least rail against the system that forces them to think in the short term. So for us, I'd say our lesson learned was, most importantly, like anything big, if you're going to try to digest it, cut it into small pieces. We put each of our individual subsidiaries through the certification process, and while they are individually still big companies, that allowed us to make progress. And actually, we learned that our company was generally doing the things that would deliver good scores anyway. Now we have a score. Of course, we're all very metrics driven, and so we can say, how do we get a better score next year? And as long as you're measuring the right things, I think that's harnessing one of the most powerful tools on earth.
Hear, hear. We do have a little bit of time, and I suppose I would be remiss, especially since we began the day, I'm hearing from the congressman. What role do you think government should play in sort of incentivizing or sort of setting the table for more businesses to use business as a force for good?
Well, I thought it was very interesting and I'm sure intentional choice to have someone like Congressman Polis here today. And I also have had conversations with other members of Congress and the Senate who have a business background. Someone like Mark Warner would be a good example. I think when you are building businesses, I think you realize that you have the power to use that business to do more than just employ people and try to make money for your shareholders. There is so much more that you can do with leveraging that. The question is how. So the question I tend to get a lot is, for example, are there any tax benefits to being a public benefit corporation? There aren't. You're a regular for-profit corporation for the purpose of taxation. Is it necessary to have tax benefits? I don't think so. Would it be a great debate, even if it went nowhere, just in the same way that the congressman was talking about social impact bonds? That discourse, I think, will focus people on the worthiness of what we're trying to accomplish in the first place. I think we need some of that debate. I think we need business, I think we need government to take and pay attention to this. Because at a certain point, if all government is doing, intentionally or otherwise, is either demonizing or regulating or discouraging, that is not very helpful for what we're trying to accomplish.
Well said. Well, we're out of time, but please join me in thanking Doug Becker of Laureate. Thank you so much.
Cheryl, thank you.
Pleasure.
Thank you.